listening to Hitachi in Southeast Asia, Social Innovation in Action, a podcast series that takes you to the heart of innovation and sustainability. Here we showcase the extraordinary power of technology and collaboration and how Hitachi is helping to build a better, more livable world for everyone. In each episode, I speak with industry trailblazers at the forefront of advancing Hitachi's vision of social innovation, which leverages digital technology to tackle society's biggest challenges. We'll share insights and fresh perspectives across a broad range of areas like renewable energy, sustainable water solutions, and digital finance, as we explore how Hitachi is driving sustainability and enhancing quality of life across the region. I'm your host, Michelle Martin, and in this first episode, I'm really happy to welcome my guest today, Anthony Smith, who is Country Managing Director for Hitachi Energy Singapore. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
I know you have a wealth of experience in this whole field of energy and power. I want to start with this idea of ASEAN's energy transition. ASEAN, we know, is a very diverse region, different levels of development, different levels of infrastructure, availability as well. What do you see as key drivers or barriers for the energy transition here in ASEAN?
That's a very interesting question. Let me start with the drivers, if I may, and I think I'd really like to focus on maybe four of them. So the biggest driver, I think, is the urgent need to address climate change. It's a global problem, so ASEAN's not immune to that. I think with countries' net zero targets, they're going to continue to dominate the energy landscape. From a country, government, business point of view. So that's really the main challenge. The second one, or the second driver, I think I would say, would be the economic growth that we're seeing in the region. Lots of ASEAN countries have good forecasts for economic growth. And along with the economic growth comes a strain on the energy demand. As well as societal growth, populations moving into the middle class, industries growing, segments growing. So that's going to put a real demand on the current infrastructure and energy demand that we have today. Thirdly, I would say the key driver is a reduction in renewable technology costs. We've seen over the last decade how renewables, solar, wind, the technology costs have really come down to be competitive or even more competitive than fossil fuels. And then the fourth driver, I think, would be people's demand for cleaner, greener, healthier environments. We all want to live in a less polluted world. We want our children to grow up in a greener future. And governments have to take notice of this, businesses have to take notice of this. So I think those four drivers would be really key. And then if I move to the challenges, on the challenging side, I'll probably talk about three challenges.
Okay.
I think the main one is the infrastructure and the integration. And you mentioned in the question that Southeast Asia is a diverse region. And the infrastructure is at different levels of maturity or different levels of state. So when we look at the infrastructure across the different parts of the region, you consider age, condition, stability, access. And I think a big challenge to this energy transition is modernizing that infrastructure. And then integrating renewables into that infrastructure. And the problem with renewables is they have an impact on the stability of grids. So we kind of have to modernize the grid first before we look at integrating renewables. At Hitachi Energy, we're a pioneer of solutions that help integrate renewables into the system, that also integrate connected grids. And we have helped enable over 200 gigawatts worth of renewable energy projects into the grid system. Through our HVDC solution. That HVDC solution is a high voltage direct current, which essentially allows you to integrate large amounts of electricity, transmit that electricity further much more efficiently without lots of losses in the network. So it's a really key element to the energy transition. But let me just try and give you a bit of a scale of the challenge of this integration. There was a report last year from IEA, which suggests that to meet global net zero targets, there needs to be an additional, or they need to adapt 80 million kilometers worth of transmission distribution network worldwide to hit these targets. That 80 million kilometers of transmission distribution network is the same as the total worldwide installed network in 2021. And to give you more of a scale, that's equivalent to 100 trips to the moon and back.
My goodness.
So the challenge of this infrastructure is really, really larger than I think anyone really gives consideration for.
That's vast, yeah.
The second challenge, I think, would be financial barriers. Lots of developing countries, in particular in ASEAN, are worried about upfront costs and perceived financial risks associated with energy transition. And going back to that example of the need for 80 million kilometers of transmission distribution cables, traditionally investment in grids and transmission infrastructure has been stagnant over the last few years. So the investment to make this happen would need to double from $300 billion annually to $600 billion annually, which is a huge amount of investment to make this happen. So I think from a financial point of view, there's lots of challenges around where is the financing, is it sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. And then maybe thirdly, I think the challenge would be the dependency on fossil fuels. As a region in ASEAN, lots of countries have access to abundant natural resources, or they have that in their own country. So if you take Philippines, for example, 78% of their power generation in 2021 was on fossil fuels. Thailand, Singapore, heavily reliant on gas. Indonesia, heavily reliant on coal. So when we look at the energy transition mix, the ability to change from a fossil fuel-based energy mix to renewable, it's not as simple as maybe saying we're not going to run a coal-fired power plant, we want to put a solar plant in. It's the supporting industries that are behind them. So for fossil fuels, it's oil and gas, it's the petrochemical industry. For coal-fired power plants, it's the mining industry. And these industries employ millions of people around the world, and they're almost their own economy in a way. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to go around how we transition from those fossil type economies to renewable. So they would be three main challenges that I would see within the region.
So a huge paradigm shift required in a very short span of time,
Absolutely.
given the criticality of moving towards sustainability. But let's tackle the elephant in the room. Given we're here in Southeast Asia, where do you stand on the debate? What do you see companies primarily weighing on when it comes to one side versus the other, on the debate between sustainability and business growth?
It's a very good question, and we get asked that quite a lot. Look, my answer to this is always there has to be a relationship between the two. Because if there isn't, the alternative is we do nothing and we carry on what we're doing today, which I don't think is viable. So it's up to us to make that relationship work.
Yeah.
And let me give you maybe a couple of examples of where that is working. So I mentioned earlier our HVDC solutions, the high voltage direct current. So we've enabled over 200 gigawatts worth of renewable energy projects to be connected and integrated into the grid worldwide. The same report that I mentioned talks about the amount of investment and the transmission grids. The report also says there's 3,000 gigawatts worth of renewable energy projects already commissioned, built, ready and waiting to be connected to the grid. So the investment in this has already been made. Our HVDC solutions are enabling that technology to come into the grid. Companies, businesses, governments wouldn't be investing in this renewable sustainability solutions if they didn't see the business growth in them. It's very simple. But then let me talk about innovation as the second example. at Hitachi Energy, we have spent millions of dollars on a new product family which is called Econic. So with our product portfolio, we develop a lot of switchgears and transformers. Switchgears are critical infrastructure within an electrical grid transmission network. Traditionally, they use what's called SF6 gas. SF6 gas is a sulfur hexafluoride gas, and it's very good in terms of its insulating capabilities, and it's able to withstand extreme conditions under pressure, stress, high temperatures. The downside to this gas is it is very harmful to the atmosphere if it is released. And in fact, it's 23,000 times more harmful than CO2, which gives you a scale of the problem with this technology. So our new product portfolio we've developed is Econic, and it's SF6 free gas. So it doesn't use that gas anymore, it uses an alternative gas. So again, we as a business, we see that this innovation element of new products, new solutions, generally creates business opportunities, and we're seeing that in our products today. And we're partnering with a lot of companies around the world and here in Singapore to promote these new products and deliver these new products into the grid.
Fantastic to hear. Companies around the world and those here in Southeast Asia as well are grappling with what's called the energy trilemma. So the challenge of balancing energy security,
Yes.
energy equity, and environmental sustainability. Things get even more complex when you think about the backdrop of ASEAN and how diverse the Asia-Pacific region is. How does Hitachi's approach aim to address these three often competing priorities, equity, sustainability, security, in its efforts to support the region's shift towards sustainability?
It's another good question, and it's a real challenge to find that balance between the three. Our aim within ASEAN is very much aligned to Hitachi Energy's 2030 plan, which has three elements to it. One is to strengthen the grid. The second is to expand the grid in terms of its reach and scalability. And the third is to evolve the grid into a smart, more resilient grid. But let me try and address those one by one. So in terms of the security element, at Hitachi Energy, I talked about modernizing the grid and the need for this additional investment and the cable. We're providing modern, up-to-date, new technology to our customers around the ASEAN region in terms of updating their infrastructure. Because before we can move into an energy transition, we need to modernize and update the infrastructure. And that's key to any element of energy security, is having a grid that works and is not susceptible to any failures or weaknesses in the overall system. So from a Hitachi point of view, that's how we're supporting the region in terms of the security. In terms of the equity, we aim to bring reliable power to remote communities, remote locations, and we're doing that around the region. ASEAN geography has some of the most remote locations, that you can find. So establishing a grid network that can reach these remote places is quite challenging. But our biggest example of this is in Nusa Penida in Bali, where we have put together a pioneering solution which takes an existing diesel generator electricity supply to a remote community, and we transformed it into a solar system with a battery energy storage and generation. So from that, we've been able to provide reliable power to the community, as well as reduce the emissions from the plant by about 3,200 CO2 tons per year. So from that, the community benefits from a reliable power point of view. It's a cleaner solution, it's more eco-friendly, and it's an up-to-date smart grid kind of network, so it's much more flexible. And then on the last point of the sustainability, I think I would refer to a few examples what I've mentioned, the integration of renewables, the HVDC solution, our Econic portfolio. We're bringing a lot of the sustainable projects and solutions to our customers. And we're trying to do that, with a digital aspect of it as well, because they need to be smarter solutions, they need to be more efficient. So we're providing a lot of support to a lot of customers around the ASEAN region in both, or all three of these areas.
I'm glad to hear about the community benefiting in Bali as well from your innovation. Yes. Yeah, fantastic to remember, you're people-centric. Looking ahead, beyond this year, beyond 2025, what do you see as key trends driving the energy sector?
Okay, on the trends, I think renewables, the accelerated adoption of renewables is really going to be key. As I mentioned, 3,000 gigawatts worth of renewable projects around the world. ASEAN has its own renewable targets in many countries, so I think the adoption of the renewables and getting renewables into the grid, as well as the modernising the grid, is going to be real key. Another trend is the modernisation that I spoke about. So the ASEAN regional grid has been talked about for a long time.
Yes.
And I think if the community in the region can pull together and make that happen, I think the benefits of that regional grid would be immense for communities, for governments, for businesses, for residents. I think that would really have some really mature benefits for the region. In terms of other trends, I think hydrogen economy is going to figure quite immensely in the energy mix. Although it's very new and it's still in its development, but Singapore, for instance, is investing quite heavily in hydrogen. They plan to be a hydrogen hub for the region, which I think will be very good. All of their new power plants they're building to build up resiliency and modernise are all hydrogen ready. So they've already taken these innovative steps on new technology, new products. So I think hydrogen is going to be really big. And maybe two more if I can.
Yes, please.
Partnerships, I think, is going to play a strong role in business community. So rather than the traditional method of a customer and a vendor pricing situation, I think partnerships, whether they're regional, strategic, global, helping each other and businesses have a robust supply chain, as well as mitigate risks that the global energy transition may present. I think those partnerships are going to be much more evolved in the future than I think just a typical vendor-customer relationship, I think. Okay, and the fourth one would be policy and regulatory evolving, as well as the energy transition in terms of the generation side, the infrastructure. Policy has to evolve as well. So whether that's pricing mechanisms, frameworks, regulation, I think that will need to change going forward as well.
I'm glad you brought up regulation because we can't forget that piece of the puzzle.
No.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Businesses often fear that implementing sustainable practices will increase costs and hurt profitability. But Anthony, you've done such a great job of really illustrating how sustainability and business growth can go hand in hand. Thanks so much for being here and chatting with me about how the transition to renewable energy can also spark economic prosperity. I've been speaking with the country managing director of Hitachi Energy Singapore, Anthony Smith, and you've been watching and listening to Social Innovation in Action.